allocated for Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian statehood. And that came to be called the two-state settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, that gives you a basic picture, except for three things. I'm going to go through the three things, and then we're going to start hearing from you. I left three things out of the picture. Number one, you may recall at the very beginning of my remarks, I said, the Zionist movement understood you could not create a Jewish state unless you transferred out the indigenous population. And you might recall I said they were waiting for an opportunity, an occasion to do so. And that opportunity came during the first war in 1948, when about, as Nabil said, the estimates are 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from the area that became Israel. And I guess Nabil's family Nabil's mother is among those who were expelled in 48. And I suspect there are people here whose parents and grandparents also are of that group. And those Palestinians, a lot of them went to live in Gaza and the West Bank. About 80% of the people in Gaza, when you hear references to the people in Gaza, about 80% are the refugees or the children or the grandchildren of the refugees who were expelled from Israel and went to live in Gaza. Another large number went to live in the West Bank. And then large numbers also went to live in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Syria. Also further off places, but mostly in those places. And they came to be called the Palestinian refugees. And the question was, how do you resolve that question? Because unlike Nabil's family who emigrated here, they lived in really horrendous conditions in refugee camps in places like Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon. They still live 65 years later in these refugee camps. How do you achieve justice for them? Should they be allowed to go back to Israel? But some people say there are now not just hundreds of thousands, but we're talking about children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We're talking about millions. And if millions of refugees go back to Israel, then the whole demographic balance in Israel changes. Israel now is about 7.5 million people, of whom about 20% are Palestinian Arab. So you say 7.5, so it's about 5 million Jews, 5.5 million Jews. If millions of Palestinian refugees come back now from their refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, it would be like in the United States if suddenly tomorrow our population is about 270 million. Is that right now? About 270? It's as if all of a sudden tomorrow 270 million Chinese were to come to the United States. It would just change the whole country overnight. And so the Israelis say, that's not fair. Our whole country will be transformed overnight. But then the Palestinian Arabs say, but we're not like the Chinese coming to America because this was our home. we have the right to go back to our home. So who is right there? That's the first point I left out. The second point I left out is, even though the United Nations has said there should be two states, one for the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza, and the Israeli state in its borders before it conquered the West Bank and Gaza, Israel says no. Israel says the West Bank, that's our biblical homeland. And Israel now has built about, or has transferred about 500,000 Jews. About 500,000 Jews now live in the West Bank because Israel built settlements there. It said, that's part of our biblical homeland. And we're going to keep the West Bank. And so I mentioned to you, it was only 20% of Palestine that was left. That 20% was the West Bank and Gaza. But Israel does not want to give that 20%. And so it has built these settlements and sent over about 500,000 settlers to live there. The United Nations, the international community said, it's illegal. You do not have any right to the West Bank. The West Bank is for a Palestinian state. And so all of those settlements, they're illegal. But Israel continues. As the person who introduced this afternoon's event pointed out, they continue to build settlements as we speak in places like East Jerusalem. And that brings us to the third point, which is East Jerusalem. Israel says East Jerusalem is ours. It's part of our undivided and eternal capital. The Jew for Jews, East Jerusalem, Arab Jerusalem is sacred. But the United Nations says no. East Jerusalem should be part of a Palestinian state. Because like the West Bank and Gaza, it was taken over by Israel in 1967. And they have no right to it. And that's basically the picture as it stands right now. And the question I want to pose to you, at least to begin with, the question I want to propose, not propose, but pose to you, is, we'll start with Mr. Mohammed Langston, because I know your name. That helps things out a bit. If you were in the position of trying to figure out how do you create justice in this situation, but bearing in mind you have to act here like a responsible statesperson, which is to say, you can't take an abstract idea which, if you try to apply it, starts creating new problems. Because it may sound fair in the abstract, but all it's going to do is create new problems in the real world. I'll give you one example, and then I'm going to go to you. After World War II, there are all of these countries in the world which were colonized by the Europeans, all over Africa, parts of Asia. And we entered a period in the world of what was called decolonization. How do you end European colonialism? And it was a real problem. You may think it was simple,